Marriage. What the heck is it? Marriage is finding someone who actually wants to stay with you long term. Marriage is two people who can't be compelled to testify against each other in a court of law. Marriage is the easy way to make sure your parents don't execute your will. Marriage is between one man and one woman. Marriage is a way for a woman to gain economic stability in the world. Marriage is one reason why the United States government still doesn't provide us with health care. Marriage is a young man taking a young woman off of her father's hands so he doesn't have to take care of her anymore. Marriage is between one man and as many wives as he can afford. Marriage is just one trip to Vegas away, baby. Marriage is slowly growing apart until you wonder if the whole thing was just a mistake. Marriage is tax benefits. Marriage is holding your family together. Marriage is giving up your benefits from living with disability or living in poverty. Marriage is a way of doing diplomacy and gaining leverage over foreign countries. Marriage is an escape. Marriage is a prison. Marriage is the central theme of most rom-coms. Marriage is big business. Marriage matters, and it's the central theme of a series I've been working on. Not my YouTube series, that's a different thing. This is a fiction series that I've been working on, exploring all kinds of different people in all kinds of different relationships, and since the boss man and I both came to the idea at the same time, all different time periods as well. So I've been doing some research into different laws over the last 100 years or so. I found some really interesting threads that connect them, and I want to share them with you guys because it's fascinating. There have been a lot of controversial marriage laws in United States history, and I think the three big ones that have been settled are divorce, miscegenation or interracial marriage, and gay marriage. And then for marriage rights that are still unsettled, we have the right for a disabled person to get married and not lose all of their benefits, and the right for people who are in polyamorous relationships to be married on even footing all around. Of course, these rights are going to be different state by state and country by country, and some rights that we have don't exist elsewhere, and some rights that exist elsewhere don't exist here. So sometimes you can be married in one place, go to somewhere else, and not be married, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with divorce. As long as there have been people getting married, there have been people in unhappy marriages. And wouldn't it be nice if you could just call the contract null and void? Well, some people thought that was a great idea. Some people thought that was a bad idea. And what do you know? Different proportions of those people lived in different ones of the United States. And so for some states, divorce was legal, and for some states, divorce was still not legal, all at the same time. So sometimes you get married in a state where you could marry but not divorce, but you'd still want a divorce. So what do? You go to a state where you can divorce, and then you come back home, and guess what? You're still divorced. You're not divorced just because you come back home to your non-divorced state. And this holds true even between divorced states. If the requirements of a divorce was met in one state, but it wasn't met in another state, if you move to that second state, you're still divorced. So for example, if you're married in North Carolina and you wait 12 months living apart and then you divorce, and then you move to New Jersey where you would have had to wait for 18 months before getting the divorce, you're still divorced. You aren't 6 months away from getting divorced. You aren't T-minus 6 months married just because you're in New Jersey now. Funnily enough, divorce sticks with you no matter where you go. Marriage is a little stickier. You might be familiar with this map. I think there was some variation of this in my high school history textbook. You've probably seen it before too. It shows which had anti-miscegenation laws and when those laws were repealed by the state, if they were repealed by the state, or if they were repealed by the federal government when it became national law that you could marry someone of a different race than yourself. Now these laws are really interesting for several reasons, including the fact that in different states they would literally categorize race differently. So for example, in California, you could not marry somebody of a different race than yourself. So you couldn't marry, for example, white Asian or black Hispanic, but you could marry white Hispanic because Hispanic was not considered to be a different race. They were considered to be white because Hispanic was descended from Spain. But in addition to states having different definitions of what the basic races are, which if that doesn't tell you that race is made up, I don't know what'll convince you. States also had different rules about whether a marriage would stand or be considered null and void when moving from a mixed race marriage state to an anti-miscegenation state. So for that same example, California, you could not marry somebody of a different race than yourself, but you could if you moved from a state where you had been married to California, you would stay married. You couldn't get married, but you could be married there. But in states like Virginia, you couldn't get married and you could not be married. If you got married in New York and then moved down to Virginia, you simply weren't married. You didn't have to get a divorce because you were not married. Your marriage did not exist. You weren't married. You could go get married because you're just with a roommate, and roommates are nothing. This next section is really interesting to me, in part because it happened within my lifetime and in part because it directly applies to me, but also because there's a fascinating nuance when it comes to what I like to refer to as his and hers laws. Just like the other two sets of laws, gay marriage became legal slowly in different states over the course of decades. If I remember correctly, Maryland was the first, I'm pointing at Maryland, Maryland is that way. Maryland was the first state to legalize same-sex marriage in 2004. And for most of my growing up, gay marriage was something that was allowed in a handful of states somewhere else. Maryland, DC, California, not California, Vermont, a couple others. But unlike the other two clusters of laws, no matter which non-gay marriage state you're moving to, you would not have your marriage recognized. There was not a single non-gay marriage state where if you got married in, say, Washington, D.C., and then you moved there, that they would recognize your marriage. And weirdly enough, I actually was an adult in my 20s dating without the ability to get married, which is so weird to me now because marriage is such an important thing. And I mean, even if marriage hadn't been legalized in North Carolina, where I live now, I mean, DC has had gay marriage for years and years now. I would have moved somewhere I could get married, but it also would be kind of bad if when I visited, I was, not married for a week. Like, what do you do with that? What do you do with that? I feel like that kind of legal loophole could be really easily exploited. Like, hear me out. Can you imagine getting married, deciding you want a divorce, and instead of paying the legal fees, one or both of you just takes an extended vacation to a yeehaw state and your marriage, at least for one of you guys, isn't real anymore? You could just get remarried. Who's stopping you? Okay, that has to have happened. I'm putting text here as to what I find. But that's not even the thing I alluded to at the beginning of this part. What I want to talk about is a pre-gay marriage legal loophole that saw gay couples as completely invisible and therefore incapable of adultery. When it comes to suing for divorce because somebody cheated, there are two kinds of states. There are the states who put the blame on the cheater, and there are the states who put the blame on the person who entered into the relationship. Basically, do you blame your spouse, or do you blame the hussy they cheated with? So if I was still living in North Carolina and I got married and my wife cheated on me, I wouldn't directly sue my wife for divorce. I would place the blame on the mistress. So down and dirty, that's how it works. But in both systems, there's a loophole. In order to blame someone for cheating and taking away your spouse, they have to have a viable relationship. So if you're living in 2011, and I'm choosing 2011 because the article that I used for the bulk of this research was written in 2011, then any relationship between two women or two men, it just legally did not exist. It wasn't anything. So imagine this. You have a man and a woman, and they're both married in a yeehaw state where gay marriage was not yet legal. And the woman starts to have an affair with this other woman. And eventually, the man finds out and he tries to sue for a divorce. And citing the reason, he said, well, there's an affair. But guess what? There was no affair. Because the relationship between a woman and a woman, or between a man and a man, legally did not exist, you could not cite an affair as the reason, and you could not shoulder her with the blame for their marriage ending. Because as long as, legally speaking, the relationship did not exist, there was no affair, and they couldn't be blamed for the marriage coming to an end. So on one hand, you could say, isn't it nice to fly below the radar? But the opposite also sometimes happened. For example, if there's woman A and woman B, and they're in a committed relationship, for all intents and purposes, they may as well be married. And woman C enters the picture, and woman B decides, she's going to go have an affair. Woman A has no recourse to sue either woman B or woman C because their relationship wasn't real. It doesn't exist. Like, it is nothing. But not only is her relationship with woman B nothing, but also woman B, legally speaking, did not cheat because her relationship with woman C is also nothing. It does not exist. None of these relationships do. So there's no legal recourse. There's nothing you can do. But let's alter the situation just a little bit. Now you have woman A, woman B, and C is a man. Woman B's relationship with the man is actually, legally speaking, more real. Even if they're not married, it is visible, it exists. Whereas her relationship with woman A does not exist. So not only did this poor woman get cheated on, but her relationship with her long-term girlfriend is considered to be less real than the guy that she had a fling, an affair with. I bring up this case study partly because it's fascinating on its own, but also because it shows what happens when we try to make a narrow set of laws apply to all people. There are people living all sorts of different ways that aren't necessarily reflected in our laws. And even though we have more marriage options now than we used to have, we still have lots that are off the table, even ones that are available in other countries. For example, just like there are plenty of places that I wouldn't be able to go with the kind of marriage that I want to have, there are plenty of places, the United States included, that wouldn't recognize somebody who had multiple wives as being one family unit. I know it's not a common way of living, and yeah, you've got to be pretty well off if you're going to have multiple wives, so it's not going to be an economic hardship, but can you imagine being wife number 2 and moving to a strictly monogamous country and you're just not married anymore? I know I wouldn't be a fan. And that isn't even to mention the hundreds of thousands of committed polyamorous relationships in the United States who might get married if they could. Can you imagine being a lifetime of being the odd person out in a world made for monogamous couples? And then there's the whole disability rights thing. You lose your disability benefits if you get married because it's assumed that the state doesn't have to take care of you anymore because your spouse will. Well, what about people whose potential spouse couldn't take on that kind of responsibility? And speaking of, there are also lots of people who can't afford to get married because the welfare benefits they receive would diminish if they had one household income rather than 2 separate incomes because, 2 married people living together need less money than 2 single people living together. One thing that I've noticed is that while arguments for the expansion of marriage rights tend to be material, things like custody over your children, choosing your next of kin, health insurance, tax benefits, the arguments against expansion of marriage rights tend to be immaterial. It's just not the way things have been done. It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. It's an abomination. Marriage is sacred. Marriage is between one man and one woman. These people aren't actually losing anything when other people gain, except in their feelings. And I'm sorry, but that's just not good enough when it comes to human rights. Thank you all for watching my video. If you enjoy my content, you can click the like button, you can click the subscribe button, you can click the notification button. If you want to tell me your thoughts on marriage rights, you can do that in the comments, and you can even leave me a tip through Ko-fi, link in the description below.